Welcome to Boston's tribute to Israel and to GOLDA MEIR. I am going to introduce the dais guests. The President of the Jewish Community Council of Metropolitan Boston, Albert Schlossberg. The 1977 Campaign Chairman, Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston, Paul Slater. The President of Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston, Norman Leventhal. The President of Brandeis University, Marva Bernstein. The General Chairman of the Greater Lowell Israel Bond Committee, Maurice Barlofsky. The Honorary Chairman, the Greater Boston Women's Division, State of Israel Bonds, Mrs. William J. Talcott. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Israel Bonds, Women's Division, Mrs. Louis Goldberg. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Israel Bond, Women's Division, Mrs. Maxwell A. Cohen. There are a lot of women, but they're still going by their husbands' names. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Israel Bonds Women's Committee, Mrs. Robert H. Roberts. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Israel Bond Women's Division, Mrs. Burton D. Rudnick. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Women's Division, State of Israel Bonds, and the first Israel Bonds Chairman in America, Mrs. Carl Spector. Also the mother of a friend. Honorary Chairman, Greater Boston Women's Division, State of Israel Bonds, Mrs. Phil David Fine. Consul of Israel, Colette Avital. Member of the Board of Governors of Israel Bonds, Bernard Garber. Chairman of Capital for Israel Incorporated, Mr. A.I. Lerner. The Mayor of the City of Newton, the Honorable Theodore D. Mann. The Cantor of Congregation Kehillat Israel, Cantor Michael Hammerman. The Executive Vice President of the National Israel Bonds Organization, Morris Zipser. Executive Director of the Greater Boston Committee for State of Israel Bonds, Elliot Sugarman. Rabbi Zev K. Nelson of Temple Emeth. Representing the Krupp family, century members of the Prime Minister's Club, State of Israel Bonds, Philip Krupp. The Consul General of the State of Israel to New England, the Honorable Shimshon Inbal. A great friend of Israel, a great diplomat, the former United States Ambassador to Israel, Ambassador Woolworth Barber. President of the Ambassadors Society of Trustees, State of Israel Bonds, Bert C. Takeoff. Chairman of the Greater Boston Executive Committee, State of Israel Bonds, Jeremiah Sundell. United States Senator Edward W. Brooke. Chairman of the Greater Boston Women's Division, State of Israel Bonds, Mrs. Lisbeth Penn Barden. The General Chairman of the Greater Boston Israel Bond Committee, Stanley J. Hatoff. Member of the Board of Governors, Greater Boston Israel Bond Organization, a veteran friend, supporter, and activist for Israel, Harry Levine. President and Century Member of the Prime Minister's Club, State of Israel Bonds, Irving Usen. National Chairman of Trustees and Chairman of the Northeast Regional Advisory Board, State of Israel Bonds, George Shapiro. The former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable John W. McCormick. Member of the Board of Governors, Greater Boston Committee, State of Israel Bonds, Sidney R. Rabb. Rabbi Israel J. Kazes of Temple, Mishkan, Tefillah. Century Member of the Prime Minister's Club, State of Israel Bonds, Mr. William Weiner, escorting our honored guest, our Woman of the Century, GOLDA MEIR. Please remain standing. Please remain standing for the Star-Spangled Banner and the Hatikvah, the Hope, by Cantor Michael Hammerman of Congregation Kehillat Israel, accompanied by his wife, Miriam.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight at the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming on the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Kol Palevar Pnima Nefesh Yehudi Aviyah Ase Mizrach Kadima Ein Letzion Tzavia Ad Lavila Iquaseno Atica Shelos Alpaim Leotam Chaveshi Be'arzeno Be'eretzion V'Yerushalayim Leotam Chaveshi Be'arzeno Be'eretzion
The invocation will be delivered by Rabbi Zev K. Nelson of Temple Emmett.
Avinu Shabashamayim, HaMeir La'aretz V'Ladarim Aleha. Our Heavenly Father, bring this light to the earth, to those that dwell thereon. We thank Thee for bringing GOLDA MEIR La'aretz, this golden luminary who has brought the light of her wisdom to the Jewish homeland, V'Ladarim Aleha, and to our people who dwell therein. We are grateful to Thee for giving us a wise and courageous leader who in a great and opportune time in Jewish history knew what to do and how to make the most of this propitious moment, knew which road to take, and knew how to elevate an entire generation to a higher level of creative achievement. Even as we are privileged to welcome this gracious lady, Aim B'Yisrael, a mother in Israel, who has guided an entire generation towards Zion, so we pray that we may have the zechut to participate with her in Binyan Ameinu Ve'artzeinu, in the rebuilding of Eretz Yisrael and the rehabilitation of our people therein. We pray that we may be worthy to witness the coming of Or Chadash al Zion, when Thou, O Lord, will cause a new light to shine upon Zion, the light of peace, the light of spiritual renewal, and all of us will be able to delight in its new splendor. Mindful of Thy manifold blessings, we bless Thy name as we proclaim together, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
There are 1,200 of you here tonight. Second of all, I want you to know that I've never been a chairman for Israel Bonds, and it's a rather interesting experience. I was just telling Golda that when you become a chairman for Israel Bonds, at least in Boston, you get a script of all the words you're supposed to say. I said to my wife that it was a book of adjectives, and really not my style. I'm a rather vain man, and I have a speech and will travel, as I've said on several occasions. And I'm a wandering Melamed. And a wandering Melamed, even in his own hometown, is unable to withstand the temptation that a large audience presents. And so, since I have some feelings that are somewhat different than those expressed in the script, I want to share them with you briefly. The first is a very simple and obvious one, and I can see on the glow of your faces that it's one that you share with me. It is the simple feeling of joy and fellowship, really of Geula, that Golda Meir is once again in our midst. For me, I was never as a child really starstruck, but for as long as I can remember, I have been and remain, as apparently all of you are, Golda struck. I also want to share with you some anxieties for Israel, and therefore anxieties also for ourselves. And the truth is that the two are one. There is a tremendous paradox in the world today. Sustained and continuous popular mass support for Israel and its cause in Europe, in the developing world, in the communist countries even. I was in Israel 2 years ago, and I met a great composer from one of the communist countries who was allowed out to the Israel Music Festival, where one of his compositions was being played. And I heard him explain that before he left, many of his friends had given him money as an act of defiance, as an act of protest against communist hostility to Israel, and said, "Here, we cannot speak, but please take this and give this to the heroic country in the Middle East." And there is popular support even in the third world. Which of us have not met embarrassed Africans and Asians, embarrassed by what their governments do and by what their governments say? And indeed, in the developed countries of Europe and the West, this past weekend, 100,000 people went out in the streets of Paris, and 100,000 people went out in the streets of London to say that they were at one with the state of Israel. And in our own country, when we see politicians becoming slippery, we know that the American people are and remain at one with Israel. And the great distinction, the separation between popular sentiment and governmental behavior is a part of the corruption of the political process in the modern world and the degradation of democracy. Governments and international organizations have joined an ugly chorus orchestrated by oil interests and the wandering petrodollar to besiege Israel, to weaken her, indeed even to vanquish her. The UN, a grotesque instrument of international hypocrisy, almost all of its public activities aimed at Israel. The International Civil Aviation Association asked the PLO to join it in membership, the organization that made aviation hijacking a common event. And Mrs. Gandhi's government, the temerity of Mrs. Gandhi and her government, Mrs. Gandhi's government, imagine Mrs. Gandhi. Mrs. Gandhi's government introduces resolutions in UNESCO, passed, of course, by huge margins of dictatorships and tyrannies, attacking Israel for its undemocratic behavior. And last week, the World Health Organization rejects the report of its own doctors, saying that Israel's medical care in the West Bank is progressive, and the political body simply rejects a report of its own professionals. The General Assembly, the Security Council, meet continuously to consider and to routinely ratify one deceit after another, one libel after another, with reference to the State of Israel. The lack of ideals, the callousness with moral and political obligations and commitments has spread throughout Europe, and I fear it has begun to infect American politics as well. A great labor Zionist philosopher, Chaim Greenberg, said that it is the fate of the Jewish people to be caught between the red and the black. And that is true for Israel today, caught in international agencies between vicious communist tyrannies and vicious fascist tyrannies. Israel must seek its friends among the democracies, and we, Americans and Jews, must be sure that this democracy be faithful to the one moral commitment that can stand the scrutiny of daylight. Let it be said clearly that the pressure that our government has put on Israel to relinquish territory on the basis of the vaguest indications, always immediately repudiated, of Arab intentions, is nothing less than a scandal. I won't talk very much longer, but I do want to make a few remarks about the fetish or the fashion of a Palestinian state organized by the Palestine Liberation Organization. It is a notion that seems to have appeal to Senator Percy and to Senator Haskell and to Senator Stevenson and to Senator McGovern and to Senator Hatfield. Somehow there is a need that there be a 21st Arab state, and a 21st Arab state dafka run by a group which calls the one Jewish state in the world racist. I believe that the butchers of Beit Shan and the butchers of Beirut are not moderate, and that we should not legitimize them or dare to legitimize them as the butchers and would-be butchers of Beersheba. Let us all understand that Arab democracy is alive in only one place in the entire world, in the Israeli-administered areas of the West Bank, where Arab nationalists, not friends of Israel, were freely elected in elections not delayed and not canceled and not rigged. Israel will make its peace with those who are its neighbors and with those with whom they live, when those neighbors and those with whom they live are willing, one, to recognize the existence of the State of Israel, which is not negotiable, and when politicians say they're for the survival of Israel, they're not saying anything. I'm for the survival of Belgium. But also that they are willing to recognize and respect Israel's security needs, and those security needs have to be read in the context of history. I read in the newspapers that Mrs. MEIR visited with Secretary Kissinger yesterday, and the press asked him whether there had been any response to the Israeli offer of non-belligerency agreements. And the Secretary said that we are awaiting word from Arab governments. Word has already been received. Dr. Kissinger's favorite moderate, Mr. Sadat, everybody else's favorite moderate, Mr. Sadat, has now once again become intimate with the PLO and Mr. Arafat. It is a body politic so unstable and so insincere that who dare tell Israel to trust them? And on what evidence? On the evidence of the Kurds and their tragic destiny? On the evidence of the Christians in the Sudan? On the evidence of the Islamic Solidarity Conference and its unanimous call for the liquidation of Israel? On the evidence of the vast death happening in Lebanon, with dead now nearing 50,000? Who dare tell Israel to trust these people? Who dare draw maps for this people and impose maps on parapets over the faithful city itself, on the exposed kibbutzim of the old borders, and the vulnerable population centers between the hills of Judea and Samaria and the sea? Golda, you are the most eloquent spokesman of the Jewish cause in modern times. You wrote in one of your books that had a broomstick been appointed ambassador to Moscow, a crowd of thousands upon thousands would have surrounded the synagogue. But we know also that the Jews of Moscow and the Jews of Boston and the Jews of the world are stirred uniquely by you and your eloquence. Golda Meir once said that one day we shall forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be much harder to forgive them for forcing our sons to kill theirs. That is a very eloquent and sensitive sentence, but it is also the eloquence of your and our people. A friend of mine, a young man called Oded, once took me to a place near Bir Gafkafa where there was a bloody tank battle, and tears welled up in his eyes. And I said, a lot of Israeli soldiers must have died here. And he said, yes, I cry for them, but it is not only for my own fallen comrades that I weep. I weep also for the Arabs whom we were forced to kill. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is a senator from the state of Massachusetts who has been a good friend of Israel. But I want Senator Brooke to know that the roughest of times that will test us and him and his colleagues are still ahead of us. Senator Brooke.
Chairman Peretz, our distinguished honoree Golda Meir, distinguished rabbis, my dear friend and the gentleman who presided over the House of Representatives of these United States when Israel became a nation in 1948, the Honorable John McCormick, ladies and gentlemen, 28 years is but a fraction of time in the odyssey of Jewish history. The early struggle for security, the drama of mass immigration and absorption, the strains of economic crises and consolidation, the tension and terrors of Israel's wars, and the perpetual frustration that has characterized Israel's quest for peace among her neighbors in the Middle East. And in the midst of it all stood a woman whom you honor tonight, Wellesley College the other day bestowed an honorary degree upon. And for some 15 minutes, thousands stood and cheered her for her courage. Ms. Golda Meir, tonight my role is a short one and a pleasant one. It is merely to bring salutation. And I salute the Committee for Bonds for Israel. And I salute you for your courage, for your vision, for the leadership and inspiration you have given not only to Jews but to all people throughout this earth. We are proud to have you in Boston. We have great esteem, great love, and great affection for you. And for your country, which you have led in perilous times, which, as Chairman has said, and I well know, even more perilous times still ahead. We thank God that we have had the benefit of your knowledge and your leadership. God bless.
Our next speaker is the Boston counterpart for Israel of the King of Saudi Arabia and the Sheikh or the Emir of Kuwait, the General Chairman of the Greater Boston Israel Bond Committee, our good friend Stan Hadoff.
I don't know how you feel, but I feel wonderful. I feel great. I think this is one of the most thrilling nights in my life. And you know why? It's not because we're buying bonds and selling bonds, because Her Excellency, Mrs. Golda Meir, is with us, standing right here. And I can't believe it, that I would be standing here and she would be standing there. 55 years will give a little, take a little. She was waiting out there on the docks for the boat that finally took her to Israel. And my God, what has happened since then? Who would have think 1,200 people in the Hotel Statler, mostly Jewish. The front page of the Boston Globe and the front page of the Boston Herald, Dr. Meir, front page, cap and gown, Wellesley. And sitting out in front, you know. It's fantastic. And about 10 days ago, I was at Temple Emeth, and I asked so many people there to do something for me. I said, for the period of then until the time Mrs. Meir arrives, do not read the Wall Street Journal. Do not read the Financial World. Do not read your financial newspapers. Forget about AT&T, Polaroid, all the other stocks, U.S. Steel. Just remember, the only U.S. to remember is us. And let's invest in ourselves. And I may seem a little nervous now, because when Mike Arnon told me that Mrs. Meir was coming, I said, great, she's coming to congratulate me on the wonderful job I'm doing in selling Israel bonds in the greater Boston area. So I said, I better ask Elliot Sugarman for the figures. And he gave me the figures, and I wasn't too happy. I said, maybe she's coming for another reason. Well, she has been very nice. We came in the cab. You didn't ask me. She's leaving tonight. She's going to ask me. I asked you to promise me something then. I ask you one more promise. tonight you have to bail me out. Everyone here has purchased, invested in Israel, whether it's CFI, Israel bonds. That's why they're here. That's why I'm here. But let's, for the moment, believe it or not, I'll be coming back a little later by popular demand. By the time I leave and come back, I know I'm going to think what I can do to increase my investment in Israel. Would you please do the same? May I thank you all for coming here. And usually at this time, the chairman thanks the staff and all the lay leaders for helping out. It was a labor of love, believe me. No one, we worked night and day to make it a success because we wanted to, for Israel, for us, and for this wonderful woman here. And I have one thing before I stop. I want to apologize. On the program, it says Woman of the Century. I was out selling bonds while they were printing the program, so I had nothing to do with that. You are not the woman of the century. You're the woman of now and forever.
It is really true that the next speaker requires no introduction. John McCormick is history, and would that we could say about many congressmen that they were as faithful and will be as faithful to this cause of freedom and democracy and reborn Zion as was the former Speaker of the House, John W. McCormick.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ed Brooks, I see my old friend Mayor Mann here, other distinguished guests who are present, and the great leader and the good lady, greatness and goodness are the two elements that make supreme leadership. The Premier, the Prime Minister of Israel, because Madam Prime Minister, once a Prime Minister in my mind, always a Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen and friends, I'm honored in being invited to join with you this evening to be present at this auspicious gathering. All Americans, mostly of Jewish origin, but each one of us recognizing the importance of Israel as a nation and the vital importance of its continued existence in order to bring about a future world of peace. I have had experiences with the Prime Minister because I was majority leader when Israel was established. In 1944, I was chairman of the Democratic Platform Committee. And we put a plank into the platform, Madam Prime Minister, pledging the Democratic Party in favor of a free and independent Jewish nation in Palestine. And that was 4 years before independence was declared. I also happened to have been in the White House with Harry Truman, Lord have mercy on his soul, a great man, when he ordered the state of our country to recognize the new nation of Israel. It was a proud moment for me to be with Harry Truman at the time he gave the instructions to our State Department to give the proper recognition to the newly formed nation. And I was also during my period as Majority Leader and Speaker in contact with the officials of Israel on many occasions. I felt that an independent Israel was not only the culmination of the dreams and the sorrows and the sadness for countless of generations of those of Jewish blood who had been subjected to persecution in various forms, some vicious, some tolerating them. And to me, the establishment of the free and independent Jewish nation was a necessary action in the history of mankind. And I was very proud of the action of Harry Truman in ordering the new nation to be immediately recognized. And I was very proud of the action taken by the Democratic Party and the convention 4 years before in declaring itself in favor of a free and independent Jewish nation in Palestine. The sale of bonds is vitally important. If I might make a few remarks in connection with that. Israel has still got its enemies, as I interpret the world situation, of which Israel is a very important part. Our country, unfortunately, is in a defensive position at the present time. We've got to get back into a position where we escape the results of being in a defensive position. And the way I see it, that we've got to establish a strong and powerful national defense. I consider that vitally important. As one who served for 42 years in the Congress of the United States, a nation speaks through its strength. 75% of diplomatic results are accomplished if the nation that you're negotiating would respect the fact that you're able to carry out your commitments. And tonight we are honored by the presence of a lady whom God has endowed with a mind of firmness, a mind capable of interpreting, a mind capable of looking into the future as she had to so many times in her official life, in the responsible positions that she occupied in her country, and particularly as Prime Minister, and which I had to occupy as Speaker, as leader and Speaker in consultations for 30 years with presidents of the United States, passing upon questions that apply to the future, and praying that God will guide me and direct me in making my contribution, humbly expressed as I say it now, my contribution to the best interest of my country and to a future world of peace. And if I might say a few words about the situation of the United States, our country. We are all Americans. I'm proud that I'm of Irish blood. You're proud that you're of Jewish blood. Pride of the birth of the origin of your forebears is consistent with greater loyalty for American institutions of government.